If someone told you that the greatest heresy in history wasn't a burned book, but a forgotten gesture, would you believe them? I'm not telling you this as a hypothesis. I'm telling you this as someone who has read the erased margins of manuscripts, as someone who has compared versions that should never have coexisted, as someone who has realized that silence sometimes screams louder than any gospel. There are things that didn't survive because they were too dangerous. And today, as you listen to me, something in you already knows that I'm not here to repeat catechisms, but to open fissures in what always seemed solid. Notice how you were trained to join your hands when praying, but always with the right hand dominating, as if the left were a mistake to be corrected, an inconvenient detail that needed to be hidden between your fingers. Nothing in this is innocent. I discovered this not in official texts, but in rejected fragments, imperfect translations, codices that passed from hand to hand like spiritual contraband. In one of these vestiges, attributed to Jesus' inner circle and erased from imperial compilations, there is an almost illegible phrase, a side note that shouldn't exist: the hand that touches the heart awakens that which the temple cannot contain. I know this sounds uncomfortable. It's meant to sound that way. Every power system begins with the anesthesia of doubt. You were taught to accept, not to investigate. But why did the word sinister, which today carries the idea of something evil, only mean left in Latin? Why, of all possible gestures, did tradition choose precisely this one to carry guilt and suspicion? Who wins when half of the human body is associated with error? When I analyzed versions of the Pistis Sophia preserved outside the Roman circuit, I noticed a pattern that doesn't appear in modern editions. The narrative isn't organized around dogmas, but around subtle, bodily, almost invisible movements. The narrator doesn't describe grandiose rituals, but postures, breaths, touches that seem banal until you understand what has been removed. The left hand wasn't a symbol, it was an instrument. It wasn't a metaphor, it was technology. And technology isn't preserved when it threatens hierarchy. Perhaps you're wondering why this was never taught to you. The answer lies not in cheap conspiracy theories, but in the very logic of power. Compare the manuscripts. Read the ignored footnotes. Notice how texts that speak of direct access to the divine were classified as apocryphal, while those that reinforce institutional dependence were elevated to canon. It's not a coincidence, it's a design. And here I speak as a narrator who has traversed invisible libraries, as someone who is not content with overly simplistic translations. I distrust the obvious. I question what seems complete. Because every system that claims to be definitive necessarily hides that which threatens it. You were trained to look for God outside, above, far away, while everything you needed was always here, in the part of the body you were taught to hide. Now, without ceremony, place your left hand on your chest. Not as a spiritual exercise, but as an experiment. Feel the contact. Don't look for anything specific, just perceive. Is there a warmth? A pulse? A sensation you can't name, but recognize as intimate? This is the kind of evidence that doesn't go into doctrinal books, because it doesn't create dependence, it creates autonomy. I'm not asking you for faith. I'm inviting you to observe, to read between the lines of your own body, to compare the version they gave you with the version you feel. The system thrives when you outsource your experience, when you believe that the sacred needs intermediaries, when you accept that there is always someone above you who knows more about your own essence than you do yourself. If what you're feeling right now bothers you, it's because something is starting to shift. And before I continue, I need you to do something simple. Write the phrase "my left hand reminds me" in the comments. It's not for me. It's for you. To mark the moment when doubt ceased to be abstract and became experience. I could end here and still have broken something that seemed immutable. But what I really want to show you is still hidden in the next layers. What today seems like mere strangeness, an uncomfortable curiosity, will transform into disconcerting understanding. Because if the left hand was silenced, it wasn't by chance. It was because it touches a point that cannot be controlled. And in the next part, I will lead you to the exact place where this memory was buried, not in books, but in the invisible architecture of what you call reality. Have you ever noticed how everyday life seems designed to never allow you to be alone with yourself? The alarm clock rings before the dream ends, the cell phone vibrates before you even get out of bed, and when you finally put your feet on the floor, your mind is already occupied with bills, messages, deadlines, news that didn't ask permission to enter. I've observed this for years, not as someone distant, but as someone who has also gotten lost in this noise. And it was precisely on a banal morning, waiting for coffee to cool in a chipped cup, that I understood that forgetfulness is not an extraordinary event, it's a habit cultivated every day. I remember a reader who wrote to me once. He wasn't talking about religion, he was talking about exhaustion. He said he felt like he was always chasing something he never reached. He works, pays, repeats. And, in the middle of this cycle, he began to notice a strange pressure in his chest whenever he was silent for a few seconds. Not pain, but a presence. He thought it was anxiety. Medicine called it stress. I called it memory trying to emerge. Because when the external noise ceases, the body tries to tell its own story. You might recognize it. That feeling that comes on the bus, in the shower, the moment everything gets too quiet. A tightness, a warmth, a wordless question. And then you do what we've all been trained to do: pick up the phone, turn on the television, fill the space. The system doesn't need to watch you if you watch yourself for it. When I compare manuscripts, I look not only for what was written, but also for what was omitted. The missing pages say more than the preserved ones. There are entire passages that have been replaced by generic phrases, as if someone had erased what gave the reader autonomy. In the accounts that survived outside the official circuit, spirituality does not resemble worship, but intimacy. There is no distance between the seeker and what is sought. And this is dangerous for any structure that depends on intermediaries. Perhaps that's why modern life is so efficient at keeping you busy. You don't need someone to forbid you from feeling, they just need to give you enough reasons not to have time. Observe your own routine. How many times do you spend the whole day without touching your chest, without noticing your own breathing, without realizing that the body exists beyond the function of carrying the mind to the next appointment? This detachment wasn't imposed violently, but conveniently. And there's something even stranger. Many people report that, in moments of deep sadness or intense joy, they feel their left hand move almost on its own, going towards their heart. An involuntary gesture, as if the body were remembering something the mind hadn't learned. I've seen this in hospital waiting rooms, at funerals, at airport farewells. Nobody teaches it, nobody talks about it, but the gesture happens. Then it's forgotten, like a dream that dissolves with the morning light. I'm not telling you this to convince you of anything, but to provoke you to observe. Compare your experience with what you've been taught. Read between the lines of your own day. Ask yourself why certain sensations are immediately classified as irrelevant, while long speeches about what you should believe occupy entire pages. What is easier to control, a text or a body that begins to remember? There was a moment years ago when I myself almost gave up on this research. I was tired of confronting versions, of finding inconsistencies, of realizing how everything seemed set up to always lead to the same point: obedience. It was then, on an ordinary night, without any ceremony, that I placed my left hand on my chest, more out of exhaustion than conviction. There was no light, no voice. There was only a feeling of return, as if something that had been absent for a long time had finally found its way back. And that feeling doesn't fit into doctrine. If this sounds familiar, if you've ever felt something you couldn't explain and chose to ignore, know that you're not alone. Thousands do this every day, not because they are weak, but because they have been trained not to trust their own perception. Forgetting is not a personal mistake, it's an entire environment constructed so that you don't recognize yourself. And now I ask you, without dramatizing, simply as one who holds a mirror up to another, what within you has been silenced out of habit? What spontaneous gesture have you suppressed without realizing it? What feeling have you dismissed as nonsense before even understanding it? Don't answer aloud yet. Just take this question with you. Because what begins as discomfort transforms into a quest, and a quest, when honest, disrupts certainties. In the next part, I won't talk about books or ancient words, but about an invisible architecture that operates behind your routine, and that explains why remembering yourself has become an almost subversive act. When I started cross-referencing versions of ancient texts, I noticed something that is rarely discussed. What changes from one manuscript to another is almost never the main story, but the practical details, the small gestures, the descriptions of behavior. It's as if the symbolic part is kept to reassure, while the operational part is removed so as not to generate autonomy. That's how I found repeated references to subtle body movements, not as formal rituals, but as everyday habits, described naturally and then erased in later editions. It wasn't exuberant mysticism, It was almost domestic, as if spirituality were something that fit into routine. I remember reading a fragmented version of a Syrian text in which the narrator described a disciple who, upon hearing something difficult, would place his hand on his chest before responding. The gesture wasn't explained, it wasn't exalted, it simply happened. In more recent translations, this passage disappears and the scene becomes just dialogue. No one notices the absence because no one knows what to look for. And so, little by little, spirituality becomes something that only exists in words and never in actions. How many times have you felt the urge to do something simple, almost childlike, like putting your hand on your chest to calm yourself, but refrained from the gesture because you thought it was strange or inappropriate? What happens to a body that spends its entire life learning to ignore its own impulses? During research in the personal archives of a European collector, I found letters from a 12th century monk describing something he called the forgetting of the body. He wasn't talking about sin or heresy, but about a growing difficulty among his brothers in feeling anything beyond their own obligation. He said that, even in moments of prayer, many seemed absent, as if they were fulfilling a protocol, not living an experience. This letter hasn't been included in any theological anthology, perhaps because it doesn't fit into any doctrine. In modern life, this translates in another way. You can be in a crowded elevator, surrounded by people, and still feel completely isolated. It's not just social loneliness, it's a kind of internal anesthesia. You perceive the world around you, but you don't perceive yourself in it. It's as if the body were an automatic vehicle, programmed to go from one appointment to another without ever asking why. Is this feeling of emptiness, so common today, merely a side effect of stress, or does it reveal something deeper about how we've learned to distance ourselves from ourselves? There's a point in the texts that has always caught my attention: the insistence on saying that knowledge doesn't enter through hearing, but through recognition. It's not about hearing something new, but about remembering something old. This idea is uncomfortable because it shifts the focus from external authority to internal perception. And anything that displaces power is usually seen as a threat. I met a woman who, after a significant loss, developed a strange need to touch her chest with her left hand whenever she was alone. She didn't associate it with anything spiritual. She simply thought it helped her breathe better. One day, while reading an old passage I casually mentioned, she became emotional in a way she hadn't expected. Not because the text was beautiful, but because it described something she already did without knowing why. It was at that moment that I understood that certain gestures aren't taught, they're reactivated. Have you ever had the feeling of recognizing something you never learned? How do you explain the familiarity with something that isn't part of your conscious history? When I observe the way we are raised, I realize that we learn early on to seek external validation for almost everything. If we are sad, we ask if it's normal. If we are confused, we ask for guidance. Little is said about observing what the body is communicating before seeking answers outside. It's as if we've unlearned how to read a language we still speak without understanding. And there's an irony in that. We live in an age of information overload, but a scarcity of intimacy with oneself. We know how to quote ready-made phrases, but we don't know how to name simple sensations. We know what we should feel, but not what we are feeling. What part of you was replaced by someone else's expectations before you even had a chance to express yourself? The more I delve into these readings, the clearer it becomes that the erasure didn't just happen in books, but in habits. It's not necessary to destroy all texts if you teach people not to pay attention to their own bodies. The most efficient forgetting is the kind that seems natural. Perhaps that's why certain questions are so unsettling. Not because they bring difficult answers, but because they interrupt the automatic process. And when the automatic process fails, a space emerges where something different can happen. A space that doesn't fit into dogma, nor into a manual, but manifests itself in small, almost invisible gestures. Can you remember the last time you spent a few seconds simply feeling your own body, without trying to explain, correct, or interpret it? There's nothing spectacular about it, and perhaps that's the point. What was lost isn't grandiose power, but a simple intimacy that doesn't translate into slogans. And the simpler something is, the harder it is to control. In the next part, it'll lead you to an even more disconcerting layer, where we'll talk not only about forgetting, but about how it was transformed into a method. For a long time I thought that forgetting was merely a consequence of the passage of centuries, like dust accumulating on old ideas. But then I began to find patterns that didn't match negligence. They were surgical cuts, precise choices. A simple example in a Coptic copy of a late text, there is a description of a meeting where the disciples disperse after a difficult conversation, and the narrator observes that each one withdraws carrying the weight on the left side of their chest. This phrase does not appear in any later edition. It was not translated, it was not adapted, it was simply removed, as if it had never existed. The curious thing is that the rest of the scene remains intact. Only the bodily detail disappears, as if someone had decided that it did not deserve to be remembered. In another unlikely find, a private letter from a medieval scribe describes the discomfort of copying certain passages because they seemed unnecessarily intimate. He complains that the younger monks found texts that spoke of physical sensation, of warmth in the chest, of involuntary hand movements strange. For them, spirituality was already synonymous with abstraction. Anything that resembled flesh, gesture, breath, sounded inappropriate. That letter didn't become a treatise, it didn't enter any anthology. It survived only because it was forgotten inside the wrong volume. What struck me most was not the content itself, but the reaction it provoked. Whenever a text came too close to concrete experience, someone felt the need to purify it, to make it cleaner, more acceptable, more distant from the body. It's as if there were a collective discomfort with anything that couldn't be controlled by words. Think about your own day. How many times have you felt something physical that you couldn't explain and immediately tried to turn into a diagnosis, a label, a distraction? A pressure in the chest becomes anxiety, a sudden heat becomes stress, a desire to stop and breathe becomes laziness. Translation comes before listening. Perhaps because listening is risky. The body doesn't negotiate, it only signals. A few years ago, a music teacher I spoke with reported something strange. His younger students had difficulty perceiving their own heart rate even after prolonged exercise. He asked them to place their hand on their chest to feel their pulse, and many said they felt nothing. Not because there was no heartbeat, but because they weren't used to paying attention. This doesn't appear in any teaching manual, but it's revealing. The loss isn't of faith, it's of sensitivity. And that's where the curious data accumulates. Contemporary studies show that most people spend less than a minute a day in absolute silence. Less than 60 seconds without external stimuli. Not for lack of time, but for discomfort. Silence has become a hostile space, when perhaps it was the last territory where something can still be remembered. On a trip, I visited a small museum that no one seems to take seriously. Among agricultural objects and old tools, there was a collection of children's drawings from a remote village from the beginning of the last century. The guide mentioned in passing that, at the time, children were discouraged from using their left hand for any activity considered important. What no one noticed is that, in almost all the drawings, when they depicted someone sad or thoughtful, the children drew the figure with their left hand on their chest. A spontaneous, untaught pattern, emerging even under repression. This made me understand that the forgetting wasn't complete. It's more like a fog than an erasure. The memory is still there, but diffuse, without definition, appearing at improbable moments, in gestures that no one can explain. It's no coincidence that some people report feeling something undefined when they see old images, as if they recognize a language they no longer know how to speak. When I gather these fragments, I don't construct a closed theory. I prefer to observe the movement. Everything that brings spirituality closer to direct experience has been progressively pushed out of official discourse. What remains is a clean, organized, safe, but also distant version. And the more distant it is, the more dependent it becomes on mediators. Perhaps that's why simple stories have more impact than entire treatises. The nurse who told me that, when holding the hands of patients in their final moments, she notices that many squeeze their left hand tighter than their right, even unconsciously. The man who, after an accident, said he spent days feeling a persistent warmth on the left side of his chest without knowing why. The child who instinctively calms down by touching their own heart. These accounts don't form a doctrine. They form a constellation of clues. Small indications that something is still operating outside the radar of institutions, outside the books, outside the authoritative words. There's no conspiracy here in the cinematic sense, but there is a method. A method that doesn't require surveillance, only habit. The more I observe, the more I realize that the invisible architecture of forgetfulness rests on three simple pillars: constant distraction, the immediate translation of any feeling into a problem, and automatic distrust of personal experience. There's no need to forbid anything if you teach people to ignore what they feel. And perhaps that's why this type of conversation seems strange. Not because it speaks of something hidden, but because it speaks of something too intimate for a world accustomed to outsourcing everything. The improbable lies not in the distant past, but in the banal present. You still have a body that reacts before thinking, a sensitivity that cannot be contained in forms, a memory that cannot be expressed in sentences. In the next part, I'll show you how this method of forgetting has ceased to be merely cultural and has become structural, something so ingrained in daily life that you probably never questioned it. And when you see this, perhaps you'll understand why remembering yourself has become a rare act amidst so much information. For a long time I believed that everything that had been erased remained only in books, as if recovering documents were enough to restore a lost truth. But there came a moment when I realized that this was naive. The most effective forgetting doesn't depend on censorship, but on habit. It infiltrates routine, the way you wake up, how you cross the street looking at your cell phone, how you end the day too exhausted to notice anything beyond tiredness. And it was at that point that the investigation ceased to be intellectual and became almost physical. I was on a crowded subway during rush hour when I noticed something that seemed too banal to warrant attention. A middle-aged man, with a tired expression, held the handrail with his right hand and, almost hidden by his body, kept his left hand pressed against his chest. It wasn't pain, it wasn't despair. It was a restrained gesture, like someone trying to protect themselves from something invisible. He remained like that for almost the entire journey, as if it were the only possible anchor amidst the crowd. Nobody noticed. I noticed because I had seen it before, in old photos, in marginal letters, in children's drawings, always the same pattern appearing where it shouldn't exist. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the man kept repeating in my mind like a poorly assembled fragment of film. What leads someone to do this without knowing why? Why do certain gestures appear in such different contexts, crossing centuries, cultures, and personal histories? It's no coincidence when something insists on surviving despite everything else having been forgotten. I then began to pay attention to myself. In moments of greatest pressure, when my mind was overwhelmed with lists and worries, the urge to touch my chest with my left hand would arise almost as a reflex. I always ignored it. I always replaced the impulse with another task, another distraction. And it was at that point that I realized the turning point. We weren't just taught to forget, we were trained to interrupt any attempt to remember. The method is simple and, precisely for that reason, effective. First comes the sensation, a subtle discomfort, a warmth, a tightness. Before it can organize itself, the ready-made explanation kicks in: stress, anxiety, tiredness. Soon after, the escape music, a message, news, anything that occupies the space that could become listening. In seconds, the body becomes mute again. And you move on, convinced that nothing happened. But something always happens. I remember a woman I met in a bank queue, one of those endless ones where everyone seems suspended in the same state of impatience. She took a deep breath every few seconds, and her left hand involuntarily rose to her chest, only to be quickly withdrawn, almost ashamedly. In a moment of collective distraction, when the system crashed and no one knew how much longer they would have to wait, she left her hand there longer. Her face changed. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she just remained motionless for a few seconds. When she realized I was watching her, she laughed awkwardly and said that it made her feel less lost. She couldn't explain it any better. She didn't need to. These encounters multiplied. The teenager who told me he could only calm down before a test by holding his own chest, but never did it in front of his classmates. The elderly man who described the feeling of returning home without leaving his place. The musician who said he composed better when he felt a strange warmth on the left side of his chest. Each isolated account could be dismissed. Together, they form a picture that doesn't fit into a ready-made theory. Tension grows because the conclusion begins to impose itself. It is not only the past that has been altered, it is the present that is being shaped to prevent certain types of experience. Not by force, but by saturation. When everything is stimulation, nothing is listening. When everything is urgency, there is no room for recognition. And recognition is dangerous, because it does not depend on authorization. What's most unsettling is understanding how this has become so normalized. No one questions anymore why they don't feel their own body for hours. No one finds it strange to spend an entire day without a single moment of presence. The strange has become the norm. And what was once intimate now seems inappropriate. It was then that I understood that the investigation wouldn't end in libraries or archives. It would resolve itself in something much simpler and, for that very reason, more threatening to any structure that depends on distance between you and what you're looking for. What was erased isn't information, it's a relationship. The relationship with perception itself. This realization brings no comfort. It brings a persistent unease, as if a door were ajar and you finally noticed the light on the other side. You can still pretend you didn't see it, you can still hastily close the door and return to your routine, but something has already changed. The image of the man on the subway, the woman in line, of yourself interrupting a gesture before it's complete, all of this begins to align in the same narrative. And now the tension truly sets in, because the next step will no longer be just observation. It will require an internal shift that cannot be explained at length. Something too simple to be taught in courses, and too profound to be ignored once recognized. That's what I'm going to reveal in the final part, not as a promise, but as an inevitable consequence of everything you've read so far. We've reached the point where the story ceases to be merely narrative and becomes a choice. Everything I've told you so far doesn't demand blind faith. It doesn't ask you to adopt a new system or abandon what you already know. It asks for something much simpler and, therefore, more transformative presence. Throughout these parts, I've guided you through erased manuscripts, forgotten gestures, silent habits that shaped how you relate to your own body. But none of this has value if it remains only in intellectual understanding. The true conclusion isn't in my words, it's in what you do with them after the video ends. Now, close your eyes for a few seconds and simply notice your breathing. Don't change anything. Just observe. Notice how, in the silence, a slight restlessness arises, as if something wants to happen and you are used to preventing it. This feeling isn't a problem. It's an invitation. You don't need to interpret it or label it. You just need to give it space. Then place your left hand on your chest. Do this naturally, as if leaning on something familiar. Feel the contact of your skin, the rhythm of your heart under your palm, the warmth that gradually builds. Take 3 deep breaths, slowly, without any rush to get anywhere. There is no goal here, no performance, nothing to prove. There is only this moment, in which you choose to listen instead of being distracted. Perhaps nothing spectacular will happen. Perhaps something so subtle will happen that you almost doubt it. And that's okay. What matters is not the immediate effect, but the gesture itself, repeated, integrated into the routine, retrieved whenever the day seems too heavy. By doing this, you create a pause in the automatism. You interrupt, even if only for a few seconds, the current that pushes you from task to task without allowing you to perceive it. Incorporate this gesture into your daily life. Do it before opening your phone in the morning. Do it when you feel anxiety starting to rise. Do it at night, before bed, when the silence feels too strange. Not as a rigid ritual, but as a reminder that you inhabit a body and that it speaks to you all the time. As the days go by, you'll notice small changes. Not because someone promised it, but because attention modifies the experience. You'll begin to recognize signs of tiredness, tension, and the need for a break sooner. You'll realize that many impulsive decisions lose their power when you allow yourself a few moments of listening. And perhaps, without fanfare, a sense of belonging will emerge that doesn't depend on external approval. This is the practical application of everything that has been said. There is no secret technique or miraculous shortcut. There is only the commitment not to abandon yourself in the middle of your own life. Every time you place your hand on your chest and breathe consciously, you reaffirm this commitment. If something inside you stirred during this video, if you felt the urge to experiment, even with some skepticism, I invite you to take a simple step now. Like this video so it reaches other people who might also need this pause. Write in the comments, even anonymously, what you felt or just one word that represents this moment. And subscribe to the channel to continue following these reflections, because this is not an end, it's a new beginning. The gesture is small, but the effect spreads. Start today. You don't need anything more than yourself.